Forget the silver screen image where a weary cowboy walks into a warmly lit saloon, drops a coin on the polished mahogany, and is immediately served a thick, juicy steak with a clean glass of whiskey. In reality, a frontier boomtown like Tombstone in the 1880s was filled with the stench of boiled fat, unwashed bodies, and food that had sat around far too long in the unforgiving summer heat. The floor underfoot was often nothing more than packed dirt, sawdust, and whatever fell onto it. Blood, dropped food, and heavy wads of tobacco spit. It was trampled and trodden in the earth, then covered up with a new layer of sawdust. A patron pushing through the saloon swing doors was hit with a wall of yellow tobacco smoke hanging low near the ceiling. The stink of stale beer soaked deep into the bar wood. The backdrop a greasy hiss from an overworked frying pan. Men hunched over the tables, not square-jawed heroes waiting for a gunfight, but exhausted, underfed laborers that would eat anything that won't kill them too fast. For cowboys, it was risky eating at these establishments because of the almost total absence of fresh food. These towns existed in some of the most isolated territory on the continent, where supplies had to be hauled by mule or freight wagon over dangerous mountain roads or across hundreds of miles of brutal desert. Most places did not have refrigeration until the end of the decade. Meat spoiled rapidly in summer temperatures that routinely cracked 100 degrees. As a result, the beef served to paying customers was oftentimes in what polite travelers described as an advanced stage of decomposition, to disguise the sickening smell and the sickly green color of rotting flesh. Saloon cooks obliterated the steaks with heavy pepper, aggressively hot sauces, and overcooked the meat until it was as hard as leather. The foundation of the frontier diet rested on what was commonly known as the basic 4 B's: biscuits, beans, beef, and bacon. But the bacon, known in cowboy slang as overland trout, arrived at the saloon in thick slabs packed in wooden barrels and was cured so heavily with salt that it literally had to be soaked in water before it could be cooked. Fresh pork was practically unheard of, leaving men to chew on meat so heavily salted that it resembled a salt lick more than a meal. The kitchens where these meals were cooked were probably more dangerous than the rotting ingredients themselves. Saloon kitchens were cramped, sweltering back rooms with no ventilation, running water, or any concept of sanitation. Cooking surfaces were blackened with thick, rancid layers of animal grease that were never properly scrubbed away. A single cast iron pot might simmer a batch of pinto beans for days on end, with the cook simply dumping new, questionable ingredients on top of whatever leftover food had dried into a crust from the day before. Wooden cutting boards absorbed blood and fat over months and years, becoming invisible breeding grounds for bacteria that 19th century frontier cooks did not even know existed. Plates and utensils were rarely washed, usually just wiped down with a filthy rag, and drinking cups were routinely shared among unwashed strangers. Covering everything in the room was a moving layer of black dots. Flies were everywhere with no place to hide, settling freely on unwashed plates, raw meat, and the tobacco spit of passing customers. Historical accounts describe the food of the time as fly-speckled. This is not a romantic metaphor, but a literal, stomach-churning description of the meals placed in front of paying customers. The horrifying lack of hygiene was compounded by the deadly reality of the local water supply. Towns often sat in semi-arid basins where water had to be drawn from shallow wells, often too close for comfort, next to outhouses, mine drainage, and general town refuse. The water tasted thickly of sulfur and alkali. Drinking this water was a desperate gamble that could lead to sickness, gut rot, misery, or even death by dysentery or cholera. No one possessed the scientific knowledge at that time to understand water-borne pathogens, so the population instead had to learn through grim experience to avoid untreated water entirely. Survival meant drinking coffee because it was boiled, beer because it was fermented, or whiskey because the raw alcohol killed the pain of the day. Whiskey was not a safe choice, though, either, because the whiskey poured in many dusty saloons was frequently nothing more than raw grain, alcohol adulterated with turpentine or creosote, burnt sugar for color, tobacco for a sharp bite, and sometimes a splash of laudanum to provide a warm numbness that kept customers addicted and returning to the bar. Saloon owners deeply understood this desperate, survival-driven thirst and weaponized it through one of the most brilliant and deceptive marketing schemes of the era, the free lunch. The business logic was ruthless and simple, built on the idea that a man who is eating is a man who is staying, and a man who is staying is a man who is drinking. Walk into a saloon, and a patron would find a table spread with food, supposedly free for anyone who bought at least one or two drinks at the bar. But this spread was not an act of frontier hospitality. It was a man trap. Every single item placed on that table was deliberately salty. A typical spread featured hard-boiled eggs, dried salt pork, smoked herring, dill pickles, pretzels, and salted crackers. A patron would eat a handful of salted peanuts or a piece of heavily cured sausage, and the massive intake of salt would trigger an agonizing thirst, forcing the man to buy another beer or a shot of adulterated whiskey. This chain reaction of eating salted food and buying drinks could drain a laborer's wages in hours. And while a few saloons in competitive, wealthy cities like San Francisco offered genuine gourmet buffets with French Gruyere, imported hams, and savory meatballs served on spotless white linen, the average dusty frontier saloon offered a grim plate of stale crackers and a bowl of morning-old beans, losing a war against the afternoon heat. Bouncers were employed specifically to protect this salty bait from desperate drifters. Locals called them free lunch fiends, men who moved from bar to bar trying to gorge themselves without paying the mandatory liquor toll. Between the rotting meat, the fly-covered salted lunches, and the complete absence of fresh fruit and vegetables, the frontier town diet took a terrible physical toll. The great vegetable famine of the West meant that scurvy was a chronic background condition, causing severe fatigue, joint pain, and bleeding gums among miners working long underground shifts. Eating food from the saloon kitchen was a toxic gamble, a place that disguised decay with spice and sold dehydration dressed as generosity. But out on the open plains far away from the fly-speckled towns, a completely different culinary reality kept men alive. While town cooks routinely poisoned their patrons with rotting steaks, the chuck wagon cooks of the great cattle trails mastered a barbaric nutritional genius born out of absolute necessity. When a crew was driving cattle across 2,000 miles of dust and danger, wasting food was not just inefficient, it meant starvation. The cowboys' daily diet on the trail was punishingly monotonous, anchored heavily by endless rations of pinto beans, salt belly pork, and dense squares of flour and water known as hardtack. These biscuits were baked until every drop of moisture vanished, making them so impenetrable that men called them sheet iron or tooth dullers, and they had to be soaked in boiling coffee for 20 minutes just to become chewable. But when fresh meat finally became available, usually when a calf was injured on the trail and had to be slaughtered, the chuck wagon cook did not waste a single edible part of the animal. This ruthless efficiency birthed dishes that horrified visiting Eastern journalists but provided the exact biological fuel that had conquered the West. The most infamous of these meals was son of a gun stew, a thick, deeply flavorful dish that utilized every internal organ of a freshly killed calf. A seasoned cook would throw the heart, liver, sweetbreads, tongue, kidneys, and brains into a violently boiling cast-iron pot. The defining ingredient of the stew was the marrow gut, a specific tube connecting the calf's two stomachs that contained partially digested milk. This marrow gut gave the stew a distinctly rich, creamy, and almost sweet quality that standard muscle meat could never replicate. Easterners and European travelers found the practice of eating organs and partially digested milk entirely revolting, openly calling the dishes barbaric. One visiting Englishman in a Utah saloon sat horrified as he watched a local man aggressively inhale a chaotic mixture of organs, bacon, and pickled goods in 5 minutes flat, pecking at his food like a starving bird. Yet what the Eastern journalists dismissed as frontier savagery, modern nutrition science confirms was a brilliantly sound survival strategy. These trail cooks were executing a biological necessity as the organ meats delivered massive, concentrated doses of vitamin A, vitamin B12, iron, and zinc. These were the exact critical nutrients required to keep men healthy and functioning through brutally exhausting physical labor. The instinct to eat the whole animal provided a profound nutritional completeness that a tough, overcooked saloon steak completely lacked. This nose-to-tail survivalism extended to other bizarre delicacies that civilized townsfolk shunned, but trail hands actively celebrated. During spring roundups, cooks harvested calf testicles, peeled away the delicate outer membranes, dredged the meat in flour, and fried it in screaming hot lard to create prairie oysters, a surprisingly tender, sweet dish that provided a desperately needed protein boost during the hardest work of the year. Experienced chuck wagon cooks also saved the massive leg bones of slaughtered cattle, cracking them violently open to expose the marrow inside. Simmering these broken bones for hours released deep reserves of fat, collagen, and vital minerals into a rich broth. Cowboys recovering from severe illness, exhaustion, or the brutal elements were fed this marrow-bone soup to rebuild their broken strength, tapping into a restorative healing power that modern diets are only just now rediscovering. Even calf brains were soaked in salt water to firm them up, then fried in lard until golden, providing a creamy, custard-like breakfast that kept men going when beans and hardtack failed. The sharp contrast between the saloon and the trail reveals the stark, unromantic truth of American expansion. In the dusty towns, opportunists served whatever rotting supplies the erratic freight wagons delivered, masking literal poison with black pepper and aggressively selling salt to sell whiskey. The free lunch was never a charitable act. It was a weaponized business strategy built on manufactured thirst. The basic 4 Bs were not rustic comfort food. They were the bare minimum caloric intake required to keep a human body moving through another punishing day. Out on the grass, however, survival demanded a brutal, unflinching honesty with nature, forcing men to eat the eyes, the brains, and the guts of animals just to see another sunrise. The food of the Wild West was never about pleasure, comfort, or the perfectly seared steak. It was raw fuel for a remarkably unforgiving world. A meal in a saloon could fill a man's stomach while actively shortening his life, wrapping chronic dysentery and scurvy in the crust of a sourdough biscuit. The true flavor of the frontier was never a fine cut of beef. It was the sharp sting of salt, the heavy coating of rendered animal grease, the frantic buzz of flies over a dirt floor, and the stubborn, desperate human refusal to go hungry in a land that constantly wanted them dead. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want more like this video.